Flight 739. In March 1962, Flying Tiger Line Flight 739, a Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation, vanished without a trace over the Pacific Ocean. The plane was on a military mission during the early days of the Vietnam War, carrying 93 U.S. Army soldiers and 11 crew members. The plane departed from Guam and was en route to Saigon when, without a single distress call, it disappeared somewhere between Guam and the Philippines, leaving behind nothing but questions. Now, despite one of the largest search efforts of its time, covering more than 200,000 square miles, no evidence was ever found. Adding to the mystery, crew of nearby Liberian tanker reported seeing a mid-air explosion, yet no wreckage was found. Was it a sabotage, a tragic accident, or something else? To this day, no one knows. Flying Tiger Airlines later released a statement saying that the aircraft was either sabotaged or the plane, along with its crew, could have been kidnapped. Yet, they didn't have any evidence to back their claims. And even 60 years later, they remained baseless theories. The families of the lost have long sought recognition of their loved ones, but Flight 739 remains a ghost story of the skies that refuses to be laid to rest. Flight 649. It was just supposed to be like any other Tuesday for Lufthansa Flight 649, a routine flight from Tokyo to Frankfurt. However, in the early hours of February 22, 1972, an unexpected crisis unfolded. As the Boeing 747-200 flew through the night sky after departing Tokyo, 5 armed men suddenly stood up with their guns drawn. The plane was hijacked. Suddenly, what started out as a normal flight was now a site of terrorism as the hijackers directed the plane towards Aden in what was then South Yemen. Their demands were clear: pay a ransom of $5 million by morning, or the plane will be blown up and everyone on board would be met with a tragic end. Now, this was actually the first ever terror attack against the German national carrier, and with the clock ticking, the West German government was left with a difficult choice to make. After hours of negotiation and 172 lives hanging in the balance, the ransom was paid. As promised, the hostages were released, and the hijackers surrendered to South Yemeni authorities. And surprise, surprise, just a few days later, they were released without any charges, most likely after giving $1 million of the ransom to the authorities. Unfortunately, the result of this compromise was soon shown as the ransom money was rumored to fund new terrorist attacks, including the Lod Airport massacre, which happened just months later. Flight 401. During the last days of the year 1972, December 29th, Eastern Airlines Flight 401, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, crashed into the Florida Everglades while on its way to Miami International Airport, directly killing 101 of the 176 people on board. The aircraft had been on a routine flight from New York's JFK Airport to Miami. During landing, the crew noticed a glitch in the gear light that didn't confirm whether the nose gear was down. While trying to fix the issue, they accidentally turned off the autopilot. This caused the plane to slowly descend without anyone noticing. Distracted by the faulty light, they didn't realize the plane was losing altitude, and unfortunately, the aircraft crashed into the Everglades. The airlines did not release any official statement about the failure behind the flight, but a report later revealed that it was the pilot who unintentionally bumped the control yoke and turned off the autopilot. Interestingly, the crash is also known for the ghost stories reported by Eastern Airline crew members. You see, parts of the crashed plane were allegedly salvaged and installed in other aircrafts. This led to multiple reports seeing Captain Bob Loft and flight engineer Don Repo on board by both passengers and crew members, even after they had both died in the crash. These ghost stories became so widespread that Eastern Airlines did eventually stop using salvaged parts from the wreckage. Flight 007. It all happened in the dawn of September 1st, 1983, when Korean Airlines Flight 007, a commercial airliner carrying 269 people, strayed off course over the North Pacific. The plane was on its final leg from New York to Seoul, after its stopover in Anchorage, Alaska. Completely unknown to the crew and passengers, they were steering dangerously close to one of the world's most secretive and heavily defended military zones: Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula. The Cold War was at its peak, and the skies were in no man's land, high with tensions. Soviet radar picked up the unidentified aircraft, and fearing it was a US spy plane, several planes, including 2 Su-15 interceptors, were sent. Despite several attempts to make contact, the pilots received no response. Supposedly, they had trouble identifying the plane due to poor weather. In fact, the aircraft didn't just come close, but it actually entered Soviet airspace twice, which is why the Soviets were so alarmed. After that, The orders were clear: take it down. And at 6:26 a.m., a missile streaked through the sky and struck the aircraft, eventually sending a badly damaged KAL-007 plunging into the Sea of Japan. Every single person on board died. The world stood still as the news spread. How could the plane's navigation system allow the aircraft to stray off course? Was no one alerted of the plane going in the wrong direction? The aftermath was a storm of international outrage. The US condemned the act as a brutal massacre, while the Soviets, cold and calculating, claimed they had no idea it was a civilian plane, and to them, it looked like a spy vehicle. More surprisingly, in 1996, the Soviet pilot who fired the shot revealed that it was clear that the plane was a commercial aircraft, but it meant nothing to him as it could have been a military spy plane appearing as a civilian aircraft. Also, he didn't tell the ground that it looked like a Boeing aircraft, a passenger plane. When asked about this, he simply replied, "They didn't ask me." Flight 990. Egypt Air Flight 990 took off from New York on October 31st, 1999, and was headed for Cairo, Egypt. The Boeing 767 was flying smoothly, carrying 217 people. Just a nice, calm routine flight. But things took a terrifying turn when just over an hour after takeoff, at around 1:50 a.m., the plane suddenly plunged from 33,000 feet in a nosedive. The cockpit was suddenly chaotic, with alarms and confusion. The co-pilot, Mil al-Batouti, who had taken control moments before, repeatedly uttered the scary phrase, "I rely on God." The captain, shocked, fought to pull the aircraft out of its dive, but the plane continued its deadly fall. The Boeing twisted and turned for nearly 3 minutes, plummeting toward the Atlantic Ocean. Radar screens blinked frantically, and aircraft control could only watch in horror as the blip vanished from their screens. At 2 a.m., the plane crashed into the sea, leaving no survivors. After the NTSB investigators, it was established that likely the co-pilot had deliberately led the crash since he had previously been accused of inappropriate behavior. The officer, who had allegedly prohibited him from flying on any US road again, was on board. The official had previously told the co-pilot al-Batouti that this was his flight, to which al-Batouti bitterly replied, "This is the last flight for you too." However, the Egyptian authorities refused to accept the conclusion of the investigation, and instead, that the crash was due to a mechanical malfunction rather than ill intentions. While the US authorities never accepted this conclusion, they did demand a technical change to all Boeing 767s. Flight 800. On a warm summer night in 1996, Trans World Airlines Flight 800 took off from New York's Kennedy International Airport and headed for the capital of France, Paris. But 12 minutes into the flight, as it was flying over the Atlantic Ocean near Long Island, the Boeing 747 suddenly exploded, sending fiery debris flying across the night sky. The sudden yet tragic explosion claimed the lives of all 230 people on board, including 16 high school students from Pennsylvania on a class trip to Europe. Witnesses reported seeing what looked like a missile streaking toward the plane before it erupted into flames. This started a wild discussion on how Flight 800 could have become a victim of terrorism. However, the investigation that followed was, at the time, the longest and most expensive in the National Transportation Safety Board's history. After exhaustive efforts and $40 million, the cause was ultimately ruled as an electrical failure that set the plane's nearly empty center wing fuel tank on fire, and not a terrorist act. Despite the official conclusion, the mystery of this flight remains, as some remain persistent that the explosion of Flight 800 was due to an attack, or even friendly fire. Flight 522. On August 14, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 took off from Larnaca International Airport, heading toward Prague's Václav Havel Airport, with a stopover in Athens. The flight was proceeding normally until it suddenly lost communication with air traffic controllers. Alarmed, the Greek military scrambled 2 F-16 fighter jets to intercept the unresponsive aircraft. When the fighter pilots intercepted the plane, they made a truly shocking discovery. In the cockpit, the captain and co-pilot were slumped over in their seats, unconscious. The passengers in the cabin also appeared lifeless, their oxygen masks hanging limply from the ceiling. The fighter pilots could do nothing but follow as the Boeing 737 flew on autopilot until it eventually ran out of fuel and crashed into a hillside near Grammatico, killing all 121 people on board. The investigation later revealed that a maintenance error had caused the cabin pressurization system to be left in manual mode, leading to gradual loss of cabin pressure. In their disoriented state, the crew failed to recognize the emergency, mistaking the pressurization alarm for a different warning. As the cabin pressure dropped, the crew and the passengers slowly succumbed to hypoxia, a lack of oxygen. Despite the dire situation, one flight attendant, Andreas Pordomu, attempted to save the aircraft. Evidence from the cockpit voice recorder revealed that he entered the cockpit and tried to regain control of the plane. The flight data recorder showed that the autopilot was disengaged shortly before the crash, likely due to his efforts. The Greek fighter pilots also reported seeing someone moving in the cockpit, further supporting this account. Unfortunately, Perdomu's efforts came just too late. The disaster shook Cyprus and Greece, leading to significant changes in airline safety protocols, particularly concerning cabin pressurization and crew training. However, some questions remain unsolved, such as why the crew did not realize the true nature of the emergency sooner, and why Prodromou was unable to fully control the plane despite his efforts. Flight 574. On January 1st, 2007, a seemingly ordinary day turned tragic when the world witnessed the disappearance of Atom Air Flight 574 over the Makassar Strait. The Indonesian Boeing 737, carrying 102 passengers and crew, vanished without a trace in the midst of a storm. And despite an immediate search effort, no clues were found for weeks. Finally, a real breakthrough came not until August 2007 when the flight's black boxes were retrieved from the ocean depths. The investigation soon revealed that Flight 574 had veered off course due to a malfunctioning navigation system. The pilot struggled to control the plane as the inertial reference system, a key component of the aircraft's navigation, failed to align properly. This failure, with the crew's inability to deal with the situation, caused the plane to spiral out of control. Tragically, as a result, no one survived. The crash placed Atom Air under intense scrutiny, with serious questions arising about the airline's safety practices and possible cost-cutting measures that may have contributed to the disaster. Flight 447. On June 1, 2009, Air France Flight 447, en route from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil to Paris, France, fell into the Atlantic Ocean, taking 228 lives. For over 2 years, the disappearance remained one of the aviation's biggest mysteries. With data recorders lost deep underwater, investigators relied on automated messages from the plane to piece together the events. These messages hinted at a technical issue with the aircraft's airspeed sensors, which was worsened by severe weather and led to a tragic chain of errors. After the black boxes were recovered in April 2011, they finally gave more answers. The cockpit erupted into chaos as the plane faced thunderstorms, iced up sensors, which ended up disengaging the autopilot. The pilot struggled with the malfunction and lost control, primarily due to misjudgments and incorrect reactions to losing vital tools. Apparently, as the plane was flying over the Atlantic when, suddenly, its airspeed sensors began showing conflicting information. After the autopilot switched off, the pilots were left to fly the plane manually. One pilot focused on keeping the plane steady, the other trying to figure out what was happening. Despite the messages flashing on their screens, they struggled to understand the issue. The pilot couldn't rely on inaccurate airspeed readings, thus resulting in incorrect control inputs. This put the plane eventually in a stall. Despite having multiple opportunities to recover, the plane plunged into the ocean. The investigation later raised fingers on pilot training and aviation safety regulations. The crash led to significant changes in pilot training programs, emphasizing manual flying skills and the proper response to unreliable airspeed situations. Flight MH17. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH17 was on its way from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur on July 17th when it was shot down over eastern Ukraine, killing all 298 people on board. The Boeing 777 was flying at 33,000 feet when it suddenly disappeared from radar screens. Communication with the crew resumed normally until 1320 UTC, but was lost minutes later as the aircraft exploded midair. The witnesses explained the scene as hearing a loud bang and then seeing debris being rained down on the ground. Investigations revealed that a radar-guided Buk missile fired from the separatist-held territory in Ukraine brought down the plane. The warhead detonated just feet from the cockpit, sending shrapnel through the fuselage, killing the crew instantly and causing the aircraft to explode into ashes mid-flight. Although the missile was traced back to Russia, both the separatists and the Russian government denied responsibility. The conflict in the region between Russian-backed separatists and Ukrainian forces complicated the investigation. Despite the evidence, including intercepted communications and video footage, the motive behind the attack remains unclear. Was it a tragic mistake or deliberate act? The world is still searching for an answer. Flight 981. Flight Dubai Flight 981 crashed on March 19, 2016, while attempting to land at Rostov-on-Don Airport, Russia, killing all 62 people on board. The Boeing 737-800 departed Dubai and was scheduled to land at 5:10 a.m. However, severe weather conditions, including strong winds and low visibility, delayed and complicated the process. After 2 failed attempts, the pilots decided to make a third attempt without considering the surrounding conditions. As a result, the attempt did not just fail, but proved to be fatal. The aircraft fell and crashed 1 mile short off the runway. However, investigations revealed a strange and shocking reality. The pilots were tired due to insufficient rest before the flight and lacked the proper training to handle strong winds or difficult weather conditions. Captain Aristos Socrates had less than 6,000 hours of flying experience, whereas the co-pilot Alejandro Cruz Alav possessed under 5,800 hours of flying. Skeptics believe this lack of experience led the pilots to make wrong decisions that were worsened when the plane's autothrottle system malfunctioned terribly, compromising engine power and ultimately leading to a crash. Flight 302. On March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 tragically crashed just 6 minutes after takeoff from Addis Ababa, killing all 157 people on board. This disaster came shortly after a similar crash of another Boeing 737 MAX, thus raising concerns regarding the aircraft's safety. The plane took off smoothly, and for a few minutes, everything was going according to plan until the plane's angle of attack sensor malfunctioned and gave inaccurate readings, which triggered the MCAS, or Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. This system was designed to prevent stalls by automatically pushing the nose down, but it malfunctioned during the flight. The pilot struggled to regain control as the aircraft entered a sharp dive. Panicked, the crew disabled the electric trim system, which prevented them from easily adjusting the stabilizer, making recovery nearly impossible. As they fought to maintain control, the MCAS activated again, sending the plane into a fatal fall. In the end, the plane crashed into a field at nearly 700 miles per hour and left a massive crater in its wake. The investigations revealed multiple design flaws and one common question: how was this aircraft permitted to fly? Flight 708. West Caribbean Airways Flight 708 crashed on August 16, 2005, killing all 160 people on board. A series of critical errors caused the tragedy. Before takeoff, the crew failed to consider severe weather along the flight path and flew an overly ambitious cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, which exceeded the McDonnell Douglas MD-82 safe limits under its weight and configuration. After departing from Panama City, the pilots turned on the engine anti-ice systems, reducing engine power, but soon received clearance to climb to 33,000 feet. With anti-ice on, the engines couldn't generate enough energy to reach that altitude safely. To compensate, Captain Ospina ordered the system turned off, and the plane leveled off at 33,000 feet. But when ice buildup became a concern again, the pilots re-engaged the anti-ice systems. This decision caused the plane's speed to decrease slowly, a problem compounded when the autothrottle failed to maintain sufficient power. Distracted by other tasks, including receiving dessert, the pilots did not notice the dangerous loss of airspeed. The aircraft stalled, plummeting into the mountains of Venezuela. Investigations revealed that poor situational awareness, mismanagement of the anti-ice systems, and failure to respond to critical warnings were key factors in the crash. Flight 254. On September 3, 1989, Varig Flight 254, a Boeing 737-200, became one of Brazil's most tragic aviation incidents due to a critical navigation mistake. During the flight from Maraba to Belém, Captain Cesar Garcés mistakenly entered a heading of 270 degrees instead of the correct 027 degrees, sending the plane westward into the Amazon rainforest. Despite noticing anomalies, such as the inability to contact Belém's control tower, the crew did not verify their position using available navigation systems. After over 3 hours of flight, the aircraft ran out of fuel, forcing a crash landing in the dense jungle. The survivors faced dire conditions, including extreme temperatures and threats from the jungle's wildlife while waiting for rescue. The plane was equipped with a beacon light that would alert the rescuers of its whereabouts. However, the beacon light could only be activated if the plane was underwater, so the captain urinated on it to activate it. After 2 days, a rescue team located the survivors. However, 11 people, including a crew member, lost their lives in the process. Flight 371. Turam Flight 371 remains Romania's deadliest plane crash, which basically occurred because of a tragic technical malfunction and human error that claimed the lives of all 60 people on board. On March 31, 1995, the Airbus A310 took off from Bucharest's Otopeni International Airport, heading for Brussels. Moments after takeoff, engine number 1 malfunctioned due to a known issue with the automatic throttle system that caused the engine to pause unexpectedly during the climb. As the plane took off over 2,000 feet, Captain Liviu Bătănoiu An experienced pilot was occupied with other tasks, leaving the first officer to manage the situation. Unfortunately, the captain failed to respond to his co-pilot's prompts, and the first officer quickly realized something was wrong with the captain's health. Struggling to fly the plane alone, he activated the autopilot. However, the aircraft's angle steepened dangerously due to cloud cover, making it difficult for the first officer to realize the plane was in trouble. With the ATS malfunction intensifying, the aircraft began a fatal roll and entered into a sharp nosedive. Despite desperate efforts to regain control, the plane crashed near a railway station, killing everyone aboard. Investigators later confirmed that the ATS issue, known by Airbus and logged in the aircraft's maintenance records, was a key factor in the disaster. Flight MF8667. The story of Shaman Flight MF8667 is one that perfectly captures just how much could go wrong in aviation due to negligence of a factor as slight as weather conditions or perhaps a few bad decisions. On August 16, 2018, Boeing 737-85C was en route from Xiamen, China to Manila, Philippines, when it skidded off the runway and landed in severe rainstorms at Ninoy Aquino International Airport. Despite the left engine and landing gear being torn off and significant damage to the aircraft, no serious injuries occurred among the 165 passengers and crew. The investigation found that the captain had ignored multiple warnings from the first officer to abort the landing despite poor visibility and the lack of high-intensity centerline lights on the runway. The crash not only disturbed flights for over 36 hours, causing more than 200 cancellations and affecting 250,000 travelers, but it also led to an urgent overview of the policies on runway safety and pilot decision-making. The pilot and first officer in charge of the aircraft were prohibited from leaving the country until the investigation was complete. However, they shortly found their way around the law and escaped. Flight 185. Silk Air Flight 185, a scheduled flight from Jakarta to Singapore on December 19, 1997, tragically crashed into Indonesia's Mauzi River, killing all 104 people aboard. The cause of the crash remains one of the most controversial debates in aviation history, with conflicting conclusions from different investigative bodies. The Indonesian National Transportation Safety Committee stated that the cause of the crash could not be determined due to insufficient evidence. However, the United States National Transportation Safety Board suggested that the sudden steep dive was likely due to deliberate actions by the captain, Su Wei Ming, after analyzing data from the flight's black boxes and flight controls. The NTSB investigation results fueled multiple theories, the popular one being the pilot's suicide attempt, especially given that he was suffering from financial troubles and disciplinary issues and that his coincidental insurance policy was taken shortly before the crash. However, a Singaporean investigation found no evidence of suicidal intent. Meanwhile, an alternate theory involving a potential rudder malfunction similar to earlier Boeing 737 incidents was also debated but ruled out. Ultimately, the story of Silk Air Flight 185 was left a mystery to be debated, and despite a decade having passed, people are still figuring out if it was a suicide attempt or a malfunction that claimed so many lives. Flight 7908. Caspian Airlines Flight 7908 operated a Tupolev Tu-154M, first built in 1987. Initially serving Afghanistan's Bakhtar Airlines, the aircraft was later sold to Caspian Airlines in 1998. Registered as EPCPG, it underwent a safety check in June 2009 and was cleared to fly until 2010. On July 15, 2009, 16 minutes after taking off from Tehran Imam Khomeini International Airport, the aircraft's tail caught fire due to engine failure. Despite the pilot's efforts to land safely, the plane crashed into a field near Janatabad, Iran, creating a crater and killing all 168 passengers and crew. Investigations revealed that fatigue failure in the left engine's rotor disc caused it to disintegrate. Fragments severed hydraulic systems and fuel lines, starting a fire. The fire destroyed essential controls, leaving the pilot unable to regain control. Tupolev had issued a service bulletin addressing rotor issues, but it had not been received internationally before the crash. The crash led to widespread mourning, with both Iranian and Armenian presidents offering condolences. A day of mourning was declared in Armenia. The incident became the fourth deadliest aviation crash in Iran, leading to increased attention to aviation safety and better communication of critical technical updates. Flight 603. Aero Peru Flight 603 was a regularly scheduled flight operating a Boeing 757-23A. just 3 years old at the time of the crash. The plane was leased multiple times before ending up with Aero Peru in 1995. The flight was manned by Captain Eric Schreiber, who had over 22,000 flight hours, and First Officer David Fernandez, who had 8,000 hours. Despite this experienced crew, the fate of the flight would be tragically determined by a tiny piece of adhesive tape. On October 2, 1996, shortly after taking off from Lima, Flight 603 began receiving contradictory emergency messages from its instruments. Altitude, speed, and pressure readings were incorrect, confusing the crew. The aircraft stalled multiple times while flying over the Pacific Ocean at night with no visual references. Believing they were still high in the sky, the plane climbed down too fast and eventually crashed into the ocean, killing all 70 passengers and crew members on board. Investigators revealed a shocking cause. Adhesive tape had been left over the static ports of the aircraft after cleaning. This tape blocked critical readings, misleading the pilots throughout the flight. The tape should have been removed before departure, but an Aero Peru employee had forgotten, leading to the tragic crash. Flight 1282. On Friday, January 5, 2024, Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 set out on what should have been a regular flight from Portland, Oregon to Ontario, California. But only 8 minutes in, it turned into a thrilling tale of an aviation disaster. At a height of approximately 16,000 feet, a critical door stopper protecting an unused emergency escape abruptly dislodged from the aircraft's fuselage. The unexpected event resulted in fast decompression inside the cabin, with passengers immediately hearing a loud noise and experiencing significant fluctuations in air pressure. As oxygen masks were deployed, panic and apprehension spread across the cabin. In response, the pilots declared an emergency and efficiently navigated the plane back to Portland International Airport in minutes. Thanks to the crew's quick measures, what could have been a fatal event turned into a successful emergency landing. While passengers were clearly disturbed, no significant injuries were recorded. However, the consequences of the episode extended far beyond this single trip. The Federal Aviation Administration took decisive action, grounding all Boeing 737 MAX 9 airplanes in the United States. The incident rekindled questions about the safety of the 737 MAX series, which had previously been under scrutiny due to previous scandals. Flight 7. On November 8, 1957, Pan American Flight 7, a majestic Boeing 377 Stratocruiser dubbed Clipper Romance of the Skies, departed San Francisco with 36 passengers destined for Hawaii. The voyage was supposed to be around the world, but the plane mysteriously vanished without a distress call. Pan Am Flight 7 took off from San Francisco near noon with a clear weather update. The 36 passengers settled in for what was expected to be a smooth 10-hour flight to Honolulu. Halfway through the flight, the pilots sent a routine position report to the ground control, as they did every hour. But when they failed to check in the next hour, without any distress signals, air traffic control issued an urgent alert. Flight 7 had disappeared. The day after Pan Am Flight 7 disappeared, a massive search began. Submarines and ships were dispatched to the location where the plane was last reported. A key discovery was not made until November 14th, when a search aircraft discovered wreckage approximately 955 miles northeast of Honolulu. 19 victims were discovered floating in the ocean, and wristwatches on several of them revealed the exact time of the crash, 5:25 p.m., 21 minutes after the pilot's last radio message. The Civil Aeronautics Board investigated the issue, but even after 2 years, they were unable to identify a definite explanation for the incident. The Civil Aeronautics Board closed the Pan Am Flight 7 investigation in 1959, but Ken Fortenberry, a renowned journalist and author, reopened it several years later. They discovered that the majority of the passengers drowned, and the debris revealed signs of fire after the collision. Pan Am and the FBI suspected that disgruntled employee Eugene Crosswaite, a flight purser with a difficult past, may have sabotaged the flight. Another explanation pointed to technical deficiencies in the Boeing 377's 7-foot propellers, which were prone to imbalances and oil transfer problems. The FAA issued a warning about these concerns in early 1957, and Pan Am's plane was required to have its engines repaired. Some people assumed that mechanical faults caused the crash, but to this day, the exact reason for the ditch is unknown. Flight 610. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 took off from Jakarta, Indonesia, with 181 passengers for a short domestic flight to Bangala Island. When the plane lifted off the runway from Jakarta, the pilot immediately sensed that something was wrong. The captain's control yoke started shaking, a warning that the plane was about to stall. The pilots were confused as to what the problem was. The pilots had no choice except to continue ascending. Meanwhile, the air traffic controller was ignorant of the developing danger in the cockpit. A warning light flashed. The airspeed indicators were giving inconsistent readings. Nonetheless, the air traffic controller on the ground radioed them to climb to 27,000 feet, unaware of the risk. The first officer noticed something strange. The altimeter was not adding up. The aircraft's speed and altitude on screen differed significantly from the marking they were supposed to be flying at. At that point, the pilots knew that things were out of control. Flying 5,000 feet above the sea, Captain Sunisia continued to keep the plane's nose up. The flight became increasingly erratic and difficult to control over the Java Sea. Unaware of the situation, the controller cleared the plane to fly at any altitude above the sea, but Flight 610 nosedived toward the sea, leaving the pilots in a dilemma. Unfortunately, they couldn't pull the plane up. 12 minutes after takeoff, the plane crashed into the Java Sea. 30 minutes after the crash, the wreckage of Lion Air Flight 610 was located. None of the 181 passengers survived the crash. The flight report showed the plane's altitude over time. The plane was in full thrust during takeoff, but at a certain point, the nose kept lurching downward. The pilots continued to fight with the MCAS, Boeing's stabilization software, in case the system fed erroneous data to the control tower. But during all this time, the plane struggled to gain altitude and, unfortunately, crashed. Flight 1036. Aeroflot Flight 1036 took off from Sochi on a calm, clear evening on October 1, 1972, bound for Moscow. On board were 100 passengers, including 8 crew members. The skies were clear, the air temperature a pleasant 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and visibility stretched over 3 miles. It seemed like a routine flight, nothing out of the ordinary. The Ilyushin IL-18 lifted off from Sochi Airport, the engines humming smoothly as it began its ascent. Just a minute later, the flight crew contacted air traffic control, confirming a right turn with a climb of nearly 10,000 feet as instructed. Everything was going according to plan, but that was the last moment of normalcy. In an instant, things took a deadly turn. At just 500 to 800 feet above the ground, as the aircraft was beginning its turn, the plane suddenly veered sharply left, completely against the commands given. It pitched into a steep nosedive, plunging toward the Black Sea. The plane suddenly vanished from the screen's air traffic controllers. Nearly 20 minutes later, a chilling message came through. Ships in the area had seen the unthinkable. A plane had crashed into the sea. The aircraft had veered off course just 6.5 miles from the shoreline, and then disappeared beneath the waves. Witnesses could only watch helplessly as it plummeted into the water. Hours later, search and rescue teams discovered floating wreckage and the tragic debris of human life. All 109 souls aboard were gone, leaving behind only fragments of the mystery that followed. The crash site, nearly 2,000 feet below the surface of the Black Sea and buried in mud, offered few clues. The depth of the wreckage hindered the investigation, and the last messages could not be discovered since the black boxes were never found. Many theories pointed toward the aircraft crash. Based on the lack of evidence retrieved, no evidence regarding a bomb explosion or sabotage could ever be found. But the investigators were convinced that the flight met its untimely demise because of a bird strike caused by migrating birds during that time of the season. Still, concrete proof about the crash of Aeroflot Flight 1036 remains unknown. Flight 111. On September 2, 1998, Swiss Air Flight 111 tragically crashed into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada, claiming the lives of all 229 people on board. The flight was en route from New York City to Geneva. The McDonnell Douglas MD-11 departed John F. Kennedy International Airport with 14 crew members and 215 passengers aboard. Less than an hour in the air, however, the flight crew sensed a strange burning smell in the cockpit, followed by some smoke that emerged before disappearing. The pilots initially suspected an air conditioning malfunction and issued a pan-pan distress signal, which indicated a problem but not an urgent threat. However, unknown to the crew, a fire caused by faulty wiring had already started in the aircraft's extremely flammable insulation. After speaking with air traffic authorities, the pilots turned toward Halifax, which was approximately 56 miles away. To avoid flaring up of fire, the crew began dumping fuel in preparation for landing, but 3 minutes later, crucial systems failed and smoke entered the cockpit. 10 minutes later, the plane lost communication with air traffic control and crashed into the ocean. breaking up on impact approximately 5 miles from Peggy's Cove. Rescue attempts began immediately, but unfortunately, no survivors could be found. Salvage operations recovered 98% of the aircraft, including the flight recorders, which had stopped recording 6 minutes before the crash owing to an electrical failure. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada's investigation determined in 2003 that improper wiring in the newly installed entertainment system caused the fire, which was compounded by flammable insulation. Flight 210. Bellevue Airlines Flight 210 was a routine domestic flight in Nigeria, scheduled to fly from Lagos to Abuja on October 22, 2005. The Boeing 737, with experienced pilots Captain Emasuin Lambert and First Officer Ashun Ernest at the controls, departed from Lagos Murtala Muhammad International Airport. But not long after takeoff, something went horribly wrong. That night, the weather was ominous, with thunderstorms gathering near Lagos, especially northeast of Murtala Muhammad Airport, though visibility was over 6 miles, and lightning could be seen in the skies ahead. The pilots, sensing the looming danger, told air traffic control they'd need to turn right after takeoff to avoid the storms. After the final radio contact with Lagos approach control, all communication was lost. A search and rescue operation was initiated, and hours later, authorities discovered the wreckage near Lisa Village, 27 miles from Lagos. The sight was horrific. The 737 had crashed into the earth, leaving a huge crater with tiny pieces of wreckage and human bones spread across a nearby plantation. Almost nothing remained of the jet or its passengers. Authorities secured the area, but looters had already scavenged it for scrap metal. Confusion continued as officials mistakenly reported that the black boxes had been retrieved. Despite assistance from the U.S. investigators, the black boxes were never discovered, and radar data was unavailable due to maintenance. With no survivors, black box, or radar, the mystery intensified. Following the disaster of Bellevue Airlines Flight 210, the inquiry was hampered by the destruction of critical evidence, including the black boxes. Several circumstances pointed to a calamity waiting to happen: a plane with unsolved mechanical concerns, fatigued pilots with questionable training, and a turbulent night trip. The airline had pushed its pilots beyond their safety restrictions, and the aircraft was judged unsafe for flight. Flight 182. Sriwijaya Air Flight 182, a Boeing 737-524, carried 62 passengers on a routine domestic flight from Jakarta to Pontianak, Indonesia, on January 9, 2021. Among them were 50 passengers and 6 operating crew members, including Captain Afwan, a former Indonesian Air Force pilot. There were also 6 non-operating crew members on board. The aircraft was built in 1994 and had been in service with Sriwijaya Air since 2012, replacing older 737-200 models. The airplane took off from the runway and was scheduled to land in Pontianak. Following the takeoff, the plane was cleared to rise to 13,000 feet and quickly changed to a heading of 045 degrees as it resumed its ascent. However, tragedy struck just 7 miles from the airport. The aircraft began to lose altitude alarmingly. Eyewitnesses described witnessing the plane explode in midair, with blazing wreckage falling into the sea, including what seemed to be shards of plywood. Within moments, the aircraft had crashed into the waters off the coast, leaving a trail of destruction. Rescue efforts were promptly launched, but unfortunately, all 62 lives were lost. Indonesian authorities said the Sriwijaya Air Boeing 737 tragedy, which killed 62 passengers, was caused by a defective throttle system and a delayed pilot response. The catastrophe sparked concerns about the aircraft's safety, maintenance, and pilot training during times of crisis, casting an overarching shadow over the aviation industry as investigators worked to determine the cause of the sudden drop and explosion. Flight 804. In the early hours of May 19, 2016, Egypt Air Flight 804 was nearing the Egyptian coast from Paris, carrying 66 people on board, met a fateful calamity. The flight was almost 180 miles off the coast when it suddenly vanished. The Airbus A320 crashed into the Mediterranean Sea, leaving no survivors. Minutes before the catastrophe, the aircraft's ACARS system issued alerts indicating a malfunction. Debris was located 180 miles off the shore, with the disaster at a depth of over 10,000 feet. Although the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were retrieved, the reason for the crash is unknown. Initial suspicions pointed to terrorism. However, ACARS communications revealed something different: a fire on board. The radar showed the plane taking an unusual path, suddenly turning left and then completing a full 360-degree circle as it plummeted. Experts believe the crew attempted to vent the smoke from a fire rather than dealing with a bomb threat. French investigators ultimately decided that the most likely cause was a fire that ignited in the cockpit. A 2022 report extended on this notion, but no definitive answers were supplied. Flight 850. On July 10, 2002, Swiss International Flight 850 was scheduled to fly from Basel, Switzerland to Hamburg, Germany on an Embraer 145. However, technical concerns necessitated a last-minute transfer to a Saab 2000, which delayed the flight. Further delays occurred when the crew discussed the weather forecast nearing Hamburg. The flight finally departed with 16 passengers and 4 crew members on board. Turbulence confronted the pilots shortly after takeoff, prompting them to request air traffic control direction in the face of severe rainfall. Flight 850 entered Hamburg. However, the pilots had to perform a go-around due to heavy turbulence caused by a storm. With 45 minutes of fuel remaining, they investigated diversion alternatives but quickly realized that surrounding airports were also affected by turbulent weather. The crew diverted to Berlin's Tegel Airport, where aircraft control room reported clear skies. Severe turbulence on the approach necessitated yet another diversion. Running low on fuel, the pilots headed toward Verneuchen Airfield, which was 20 miles away. The aircraft attempted a hazardous landing. Despite being warned to land beyond the embankment, the Saab 2000 touched down too early, causing all landing gear to shear off. The plane skidded a quarter of a mile down the runway before the engines caught fire, which the crew promptly extinguished. Fortunately, none of the 20 on board were wounded. The study, which took more than 8 years to complete, blamed the tragedy on weak meteorological data, incorrect ATIS information, and inadequate runway markings.